Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Granada Forum. Tonight, we are pleased to present Mr. Joel Skousen as guest speaker. Mr. Skousen is a political scientist by trade and by training, and specializes in the philosophy of law and constitutional theory. How would you like to do that for a living? And is also a high security design specialist for self-sufficient residences and retreats. His latest book in this field is titled Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. It is available this evening for purchase. Mr. Skousen presently moderates two Y2K forums on the internet for GaryNorth.com and is active in consulting nationwide. He is past chairman of the Conservative National Committee in Washington, D.C., and former executive editor of Conservative Digest. For 2 years, he published a newsletter titled World Affairs Brief and served as a senior editor of Cogitations, a quarterly journal on law and government. As a side note, he also served as a fighter pilot for the Marine Corps during the Vietnam era. The subject of his presentation this evening is the inner workings of the dark side of government. This will not be a session of hearsay and supposition. Mr. Skousen's presentation will be based upon corroboration and detailed evidence from actual government agents who have gone public with their stories. Now, please join me in a nice warm welcome from Mr. Skousen.
I'd like to welcome you all tonight to the grand ballroom of the ship Titanic. I have the distinct displeasure as being the ship's architect to announce to you that the ship is going down in 5 hours. Now, I don't hear any tinkling glasses anymore, any joking, but I see some smiles. I don't think you believe me. Let me give you some details. There are not enough lifeboats on this ship, and there's no other ships around. That means some of us are going to die, and you have about 5 hours to consider that. What are you to do? A lot of you are simply going to freeze and do nothing because the situation is hopeless for at least half of us. Some of you are going to hope that God will intervene and change the events. But in any case, you're going to sit there and wait until those hopes are either materialized or they're not materialized. Some of you are going to pray, which I highly recommend, and then again you may do nothing. Now I'm going to switch scenes a little bit, and I'm going to give you an analysis of another ship, the USS America. I'm also going to analyze it. I'm not the ship's architect. The architect of that ship were the founding fathers that gave us the Constitution. They passed away some time ago and left us that heritage. But in any case, this ship is going down in about 5 years. Now you think about that. You people in the grand ballroom are just a select part of the thousands and millions of people on this USS America. You represent probably part of the 2%. You've been fighting this battle to protect the Constitution for many years, haven't you? A lot of you are old-timers. I met a few that knew my Uncle W. Cleon Skousen, who was one of the great champions of the U.S. Constitution, probably did more than any other man in this country to educate millions of people about the Constitution. But let me give you a little brief analysis. As a consulting engineer, self-appointed, of the USS America, of what the state of this ship is. Because what I fear is, because you have been at the battlefront fighting and trying to elect and get this thing turned around, But you're going to continue to do so right up to the moment the ship goes down and you won't prepare to save yourself. Now think about that for a moment. If the ship were going down and you were on the Titanic, would you sit here and listen to my lecture? If I took 5 hours? You wouldn't be very smart, would you? You'd start moving up, and if you couldn't get on one of those life rafts, what would you do? Well, everyone on the Titanic sat around, but you know how much floatable material was on that ship? You know how many people could have been saved if they lashed together with bedspreads, with sheets, with anything they could, all of the wooden floating material, all of those chairs, all of those tables, all of those water tanks they could have emptied out, and they could have made floatable tanks. They had 5 hours. That's enough to save probably the half that died because of the lack of lifeboats. But they froze, didn't they? Because they were not used to getting their hands dirty. And they were used to being told what to do. They were used to looking at the captain of the ship for guidance, who gave them no guidance. And you Americans, even though you despise this captain, you still look for leaders. And we have to individually consider, what have I got to do to prepare to survive the sinking of the USS America? Now, I'm not going to give you a complete disastrous feeling tonight. I'm going to give you some hope. Because this ship, in fact, will have survivors. And I'd like to see all of you on the surviving end. But you've got to be smart and realistic about it. I'm going to be very serious about the fact that we're not going to play any more Pollyanna games about hope. We're going to prepare as if this cannot be turned around, and if it does in the process, you won't be hurt. You'll still be a survivor. You won't have wasted any time. But in order to survive, you've got to understand the exact situation of this ship. There's something wrong with the engine, the crew is telling us. It's overloaded with debt. The entrepreneurial pistons are burned out with taxes and regulations. The engines are fouled and fueled with vaporized fiat money. But you know, all of that can be fixed. And we have a lot of engineers right on board in the conservative camp who can tell you how to fix the engine of the USS economy and make it really strong, can't we? Got a lot of people spending a lot of time on that. But I'm here to tell you that isn't the problem. The engines are irrelevant. Now think about that. The engines are irrelevant. Why? Because I'm here to tell you that the crew has entered into a conspiracy to sink this ship and steer it onto an iceberg. While you're thinking about fixing the engines, and while you're dedicating all of your time to electing Republicans to the engineering committee to fix the engine of the state, the crew is planning on grounding this ship and sinking it. Now, that speaks of conspiracy. That's hard to prove. I'm going to give you some evidence. The big problem is that the crew has all the keys and they've locked themselves in the steering room and we can't get to them. And I'm going to tell you about those locks and the way that they've kept you from removing them from the ship. But I'm here to tell you that we have 5 years. Could be a little bit more, but don't count on it. The crew keeps encouraging you to fix the engines and to send your representatives to the engineering committee, but that's not going to help. Let me tell you about the crew. The crew owns all of the keys of power to this ship, and we can't get to them. They own 100% of the presidency, lock, stock, and barrel. That means they own the administration, about 99%. Why 99%? Because it's about 1% that end up and would be whistleblowers that are still patriotic, and we can learn some information from them. Unfortunately, they own 90% plus of the U.S. military. I was very disappointed when PDD 60 came around, where the president instructed the U.S. military to absorb a first nuclear strike. And I had a friend who was a mutual friend of the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, my old service organization. I called him up and I asked him if he would ask the general if he knew about PDD 60. He called me back about a week later and said, you know, I saw the general, and he knew very well about PDD 60. I said, what did he say about it? He said, we fought this thing tooth and nail. And then we were told to shut up and never say anything to the public about it. Were the other generals, was the Commandant of the Marine Corps disturbed? He says, very, very disturbed. But you didn't hear a peep out of them, did you? Why not? Because our military has been sold a bill of goods. They've been sold the bill of goods that because of civilian control of the military is the rule of law, and it's the right rule of law, but it means ultimate civilian control. It doesn't mean civilian control from the very first order that's given. When a commander-in-chief comes to you and tells you to do something suicidal, even though you have ultimate civilian control, if he's got 5 years or 2 months before those orders are carried out, you can take it public. You can argue it publicly, like George Patton would have done, or General MacArthur would have done. But our military generals won't do that anymore. And so you're left unknowing. The head of the Strategic Command, in charge of our missile forces, didn't tell you a peep. Neither did the Marine Corps, and I'm very disappointed because the Marine Corps is acquiescing to a great deal of training assignments to train the U.S. Marines, one of the most patriotic outfits in the United States, in not only urban warfare, but specifically the scenarios that they're preparing for is to take down dissidents within the United States. Oh, they're being told there are Bosnians that we're practicing on. But when you look at what they did in Delaware, where they went to a little town and practiced getting kids at the playground to tell them which of their parents had private weapons and to lead them so that they could show them where that was, that's not a scenario that fits Bosnia. And when they go into Corpus Christi, Texas, or Kingsville, Texas, and start shooting up the ground with live ammunition without telling the people in the city, they're practicing for something that isn't about urban warfare. Let me tell you something about that little practice. I couldn't figure out why is it that the United States Army would risk blowing up their entire good relationships with the city by running into Kingsville, Texas, and doing a live fire exercise in the middle of the night, where they even crashed one helicopter into a telephone pole and set a house on fire. And was the city upset? You bet the city was upset. And you know, I finally figured out that's what the Army was actually testing. The Army was tested because they could have very easily made sure that they didn't disturb anyone. They could have announced it so that no one would have been disturbed, or they could have been disturbed, but at least they would have said, it was told to us and we knew it was coming. Is the Army stupid? No. What they wanted to test was their ability to silence even an entire city of irate citizens, and to see if the press would help them silence that, to see how much coverage did they get if someday they go in to take out a bunch of patriots, and to see if the rest of the community would kowtow to that and not say a peep. And in fact, they have suppressed it. If you haven't been tuned in to WorldNet Daily or the internet, you didn't even know about it. It wasn't in the press, it wasn't in the major newspapers, it was a complete blackout. So that's so much for being able to trust our military. And I'm not saying that because individual military soldiers are a problem. Unfortunately, many of them are going to play yes men to the military. And I'll tell you why. Because we have taught them time and time again that obeying orders is everything that's important. Do you know what the problem was in World War II with the putting away of the Jews? The problem wasn't an atmosphere of hate and an atmosphere of racism. Yes, it's true that there was a fomentation of that by the Nazis. You know what the real problem was in Germany? It was a yes-manship to law. It was that law was sacrosanct, and you didn't dare in Germany disobey the law. That was the problem, because everybody said yes, sir, when they came to take anybody away, because that's the way that they were trained. And that's the way that Americans are trained. How many times have you been heard, if you don't like the law, you never rebel. We don't believe in civil disobedience unless it's on the left. You don't believe in civil disobedience, you go and change the law. And can you change the law if you don't own the majority? You can't. And that's why we had constitutional protections, because constitutional protections say to the majority, you can't do it. I don't care how big of a majority you have. That's what our constitutional system is all about. There is this respect for law. But unfortunately, we shouldn't be teaching respect for law. We should only be teaching respect for good law. And we should teach people how to distinguish between bad law and good law. We don't do that anymore. In the public schools, what you teach them is, you teach them phony fundamental rights, the right to a free lunch, the right to welfare, the right to an education, the right to medical care. None of those are rights. True fundamental rights are rights that everyone can exercise simultaneously without forcing someone to serve your needs. You can't have a fundamental right to an education because I got to force somebody to be a teacher. I got to force somebody to build the school, provide the maintenance. You can't have a fundamental right to medical care. If it's a fundamental right, you got to force somebody to be the doctor, the nurse, provide the hospital, provide all of the other facilities. There's also the fear of losing your job. That's how they keep people saying yes in the military. They also keep replacing people with patriotic or any type of feeling of resistance to yes-manship. I saw that when I was in the military. I had one of my colonels tell me one time, because I was trying to suggest a little too vehemently, some suggestions for improvements in the Marine Corps, and he said, "Captain Skousen, we don't want your suggestions. We want people who will do it the way the Marine Corps has done it 10 years before, 50 years before. We've got a system that's proven. We don't want it changed. We don't want innovation. You're a problem." How long is the system going to last when the person trying to innovate is the problem? So they keep replacing people. And the people who are innovators, the people who are thinkers, get out of the military. And I can say with full predictability and full assurance that there isn't a single general in the general ranks of any of the armed services that is comparable, even close, to a George Patton or a Douglas MacArthur. Now, they had their flaws. I'm not putting them up as perfect people. But they knew what was right from wrong, and they knew how to fight a battle, and they knew how to tell yes men to take a hike. There's the excessive and false use of national security. When they went into Kingsville and they went in later to San Antonio and rounded up a couple of patriot journalists who were photographing the Night Stalkers in their urban warfare training, the first thing they did is come up while they were taking away their fundamentals and yell, "National security, national security." In other words, we can justify anything with national security. If you hear that word anymore, I want you to realize that national security really is a code name. It means national conspiracy. You just think about that. When they pull out a badge and say, "National security, you can't talk and I can't tell you, and I'm not going to identify myself to you. I'm not going to tell you what the warrant says. I may not even have a warrant." That's what happens. They just shove that badge in your face and they say, "National security." You're supposed to freeze and say nothing. The press is supposed to freeze and say nothing. The judge is supposed to freeze and say nothing. National security is a cover for national conspiracy. And then there are the threats and the imprisonment and the intimidation. And they often take people out. And they let people know about it. They do it publicly because it sends a chill down the rest of the spine of those that are in government. It's just like Monica Lewinsky told Linda Tripp, something could happen to me. And that's what every one of these poor women who had been either raped or taken advantage of by Bill Clinton were told by either their bodyguard or Bill themselves, "You better keep this quiet or something could happen to you." This crew on this USS America owns 100% of the Justice Department. When Bill Clinton came in, he and Janet Reno replaced every single U.S. attorney. Now, that's the first time any administration has replaced every single U.S. attorney. So you can bet every one of them is a certified person that will do the work of the dark side of government. They control 100% of the FBI leadership, though only about 50% of the agents, in my opinion. It used to be they didn't own hardly any of the agents. They had to coerce them to be yes men. Now they know how to choose, and they know how to rid the agency of people who won't say yes. And they test them regularly. They give them assignments that they know are illegal, but they say national security. And they test their conscience. They test their ability to resist. And they start dividing them between what they call, not my words, what they call the black side of the FBI and the white side. If you doubt my words, do you remember that news report that came out about 3 or 4 years ago about this party that various federal agents, several hundred federal agents were having in Tennessee called the Good Old Boys Roundup? That's what it was called. And the press didn't ask the right questions. They were concerned about one thing, that one of the agents had told the press, had leaked to the press, that they had a nigger hanging tree with a Negro being hung in effigy, which they would practice taunting and joking with, etc. And the press was incensed. But they weren't asking the right question. What's the right question? What were agents of the CIA, not all of the CIA, but selective agents of the CIA, FBI, DEA, INS, Coast Guard, and various military doing at the same party? What did they have in common? Who brought them together? Who made the selection? Think of it. They didn't ask the right question. Look at the FBI Filegate case. They weren't asking the right questions. Even conservatives didn't ask the right questions. What is it? It's not whether or not Hillary Clinton had 900 files on conservatives. The real question is, everyone assumed, well, she got them from the FBI, and so that's okay for the FBI to have them, right? No, that's the question. What the devil is the FBI doing with files on 900 conservative congressmen and people in the United States? Is it a crime to be a conservative congressman? Why is there dirt being collected? Why are we spending tax money to have FBI agents following conservative congressmen? That's the question. And nobody asked it, did they? You see, I'm afraid we've been dumbed down. They set the agenda. We've got to be smarter and look at the questions. What's happening? What's the thread of conspiracy that's going through? Because that shows conspiracy. That you have secret things occurring within agencies and nobody's asking the right questions. They own 100% of the CIA leadership, and about 80% of the agents are on the black side, and about 20% on the good side. The good side has been rousted out ever since the Carter administration with Stansfield Turner took over the CIA and rousted out the James Angleton group. There actually have been several competing agencies within the spook side of government, Office of Naval Intelligence and Defense Intelligence Agency. A lot of these are competing agencies. They're not good competing agencies. What I suspect that there's competing for the attention of those who control this government so that they can advance their own agenda. And they often sabotage each other's operations. And it makes it look like there's good guys and bad guys, but in reality it's all bad guys versus bad guys trying to get the attention of the higher-ups. The DEA is completely controlled. And why is the DEA controlled? Have you ever thought, why is it that our prisons are full of drugs? Think of it. How do you get drugs into a prison? A maximum security prison. Do you believe the story that somehow they smuggle that in? Have you seen how visitors get to visit with people in a high security prison? Do you think you can smuggle something through a bulletproof glass wall? How's that stuff coming in? The administration is into that. I'll tell you a little bit about the people who've been inside the prison and have told how the dark side of government controls the prisons. Why do they control the prisons? Because they got a lot of federal agents and whistleblowers that have been taken down or inside prison, and they want to make sure they get a rough time. These are like the Hanoi Hilton right here in the United States. And this dark side of government controls 100% of the U.S. State Department, and have for years. That's been one of their prime organizations to take down nations, not only this nation. And they controlled 100% of the ship's PA system. I'm talking about the media. And so you see, you're sitting here in the ballroom, you're getting upset about what I, as a consulting engineer, am telling you about the state of the ship. And yet you say, I've got to warn the rest of the 275 million passengers. But you can't do that without a PA system. Until the internet came along. It's kind of like a surreptitious little magic thing of wiring and wireless stuff that went through and it's bypassing the regular media. It's an opportunity, and I'll talk a little bit more about the internet and why we've got to grow up and get up with the technology, because it provides us one more area to grow and grow our forces before this ship goes down. They control 100% of our public schools. And why is that important? You got to keep the majority of people dumbed down, because they've turned us into a democracy instead of a limited representative republic. And I mean limited because it isn't enough to be a republic. A republic just means a representative democracy, but that isn't enough, is it? It's got to be a constitutionally limited majority rule system, so that even a majority of representatives, of which there's no virtue in being a representative, there's got to be limits on lawmaking power. And that's the answer to term limits, by the way. We don't really believe in term limits. I'll tell you why. It's because it's much easier to replace liberals with liberals than it is to replace a Ron Paul in Congress with another conservative, isn't it? Term limits are only going to nail us, but that's not the point. It doesn't solve anything. The only thing that solves the legislative problem is laws against lawmaking, where I don't care if you got communists in there. They can't legislate what they want to legislate, or they go to jail. Now that's what you need. That's what our Constitution originally did. But it was quickly interpreted away by the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, they own about 50% of the private schools. And not because it's direct control, but because they control them through the credentialed process. They've gotten about half of the schools to tie into state credentials. So they have to have credentialed teachers. Not only do they own public education, they own the teachers' colleges. In fact, they owned the teachers' colleges before they owned public education. And it was through teachers growing up with this pablum stuff they learn in how to be a teacher, which is how to be permissive and how to never discipline, and how to teach the type of curriculum that they do, that we've got so many problems. They own about 75% of Congress. They own about 95% of the Democrats, and they own about 50% of the Republicans. There's only about a dozen Republican congressmen, in my estimation, that are real, true constitutional conservatives, of which would never compromise. The rest of them are traditional conservatives who, because they don't know what the real score is and the limitations of lawmaking, can be tricked into voting one way or the other. So we lose about 75% of Congress. And the worst of all, of which I have just recently come into information, and I had never thought it was this bad, but I have found in the past 2 years that they own 70% of the courts. Now, I had never thought that it was that high. Thank you very much. Until a book came out in the last 2 or 3 years by a very fine, actually no ideological patriot, had no ideology, just a fine, honest man that got taken down by government. It's the story of Rodney Stitch in Defrauding America. I'm going to tell you why this is the biggest piece of dynamite to put in the conservative hands that's come along in this century. Better even than my uncle's book, The Naked Capitalist, which talked about the way in which the capitalists have engaged in a conspiracy to build up communism, build up the other side. But I'll tell you a little bit more about Defrauding America in a minute. Let me tell you a little bit about the passengers you're dealing with. I'm speaking to a select group. We may call it speaking to the choir, because you've agreed with me and you've been around a long time. Some of you are probably new, but let me tell you about the passengers you're dealing with. Because a lot of Americans erroneously think Americans are with us. If we could just get our message out to Americans. Well, I hope the impeachment procedure disabused you of that. They wouldn't have done what they had done unless they were sure that they could get away with it and that the public really wasn't going to rile up. Now, a lot of conservatives still say they're manipulating the polls. You're right. They're partially manipulating the polls, but not below the 50% level. We have lost the majority, ladies and gentlemen. They can manipulate it maybe an additional 10%, but when 60 and 70 and 75% of the people are dumb enough to not be disturbed about Bill Clinton, you have lost the majority. Even if it's 60-38, the 38% of good people who are concerned about the country are too naive to see the evidence of conspiracy. And I can somewhat see that, because they work awfully hard at keeping it under the rug. And if you ever mention the C word in public, if you ever mention the conspiracy word in public, you're going to get laughed right off the stage. But you know what I've decided? We don't want to play their game. Whenever I'm in public and on the radio now, I talk about the C word. I talk about conspiracy and say I have credible evidence. And I'll go head to head with the press, because I've determined that the one thing they don't want you to talk about is conspiracy. They desperately don't want the American people to wake up about conspiracy. If, in fact, we have a chance to save the ship from going down in 5 years, it's only because we'll convince people there's a conspiracy. So as long as we have willy-nilly Republican conservative candidates who will say, but I couldn't mention conspiracy up there, they just laughed me off the stage, we're dead. If you got one at least that has the courage to say, I've got proof, and started raise this kind of a book where there's proof. Now, it's not the proof about the Illuminati. It's not the proof about the Masonics. It's not the proof about the Trilateral Commission, because we don't have any defectors from the Trilateral Commission. But you know what he found in prison? Whistleblowers and defectors all through the CIA, the FBI, the DEA, the INS, the Coast Guard, the military. They're all in prison, the ones that aren't dead. And when he got out of prison, he got their depositions. And what does a deposition mean? It means nothing, except the way that he got it. When he got out of prison, he got his little conference call set up, and they had telephone privileges in the federal prisons where most of these people were at. So they had this 15-minute telephone privilege once a day. They'd call him on the phone. He'd get on his conference call equipment. He'd say, all right, I'm going to check out your story. You dial Langley, Virginia. Talk to your CIA handler you told me so many stories about, and we'll see if it's really true. Gunther Grossbacher dials up the CIA in Langley, operator offers, CIA, Langley, Virginia. Let me talk to so-and-so in this particular department. Give me your code number. He gives him a code number, dials right in. Hello, this is Gunther Grossbacher. Grossbacher, what are you doing? I thought you were in prison. Yeah, I'm still in prison. When are you guys going to get me out? And goes through for a half an hour talking with these people about the operations that he did, what's the next operation going to be, et cetera, and it's all on tape. And Grossbacher told him about the CIA working drugs and things and knocking off people using the Mossad for some of the more difficult assignments that they have overseas. He says, prove it to me. All right, I'll call the U.S. Israeli embassy over there in Washington, D.C. and talk to so-and-so. He dials it up, calls in and talks to them, records the conversation. You can't fake that stuff. This is real corroboration. So not only do you have 4 or 5 chapters of Rodney Stick's thing taken down by the U.S. government, which is one of the most beautiful things because they took on the wrong guy. This is the guy that thought, he'll play dead instantly because he's got no ideology. He's not a conservative, he's not a liberal. He'll just melt away. But he was a tenacious little Austrian, and he wouldn't give up. And he said, this is wrong. And just out of sheer orneriness, he decided to fight these people. And he's highly legally trained, a FAA aviation inspector. And because he was highly legally trained and had a lot of money, made a lot of money, he was able to fight them in court so many times in court that they ended up putting a paper trail on him that proves conspiracy in the courts. No less than 15 or 20 routes all the way to the Supreme Court, rubber stamping totally illegal, impeachable experiences by the courts. And I'll detail a little bit to that if I can find it. But you see, that's the kind of evidence that you need. You give them, my uncle's book is as good as it is about talking about the history of the CFR and the Trilateral Commission. Their eyes glaze over and they say, oh, I've heard all that before and there's no proof in here. This is just speculation. This is not speculation. You give any honest person this book and all of a sudden they say, wow, I may not want to hear this, but they won't sit there to your face say, I don't believe in conspiracy anymore. And that's what this is important at, because it has the capability of rallying people who can do us some good. Now, you're part of the 2%, if I'm going to be very generous. And I've heard many conservatives say, well, it only took 2% of the Russian communists to take over Russia. So with our 2%, we can win back this nation. Guess again, ladies and gentlemen. You've got to remember human psychology and spiritual things. You can use 2% to corrupt a person in the direction of their corruption, where it's natural for men to flow. And where is it natural for men to flow? To socialism, to benefits. Government's your friend. Government's going to help you out. You have been persecuted. The Tsar took away your liberties, and we're going to give you the freedom to an education, the freedom to a free lunch. Is that easy to do? You bet that's easy to do. And the dumber, the better. But 2% to take them back uphill, against the stream. I'm going to take away those phony rights of yours. I'm going to give you the chance to go out in the free market and compete against all those smart guys, and compete against all those Americans, and compete against those Germans. And you know what those Russians will say? Just like they've been saying for the past 5 years, give me back communism. As bad as it was, at least we had a free meal and we had free medical care. And that's exactly what they're doing. In fact, we gave them such a phony version of the free market, they hate America now. They used to love America over there. Despite all the propaganda, they knew that there was something righteous about America. Now all they've been told is that this free market stuff that's torturing you is all the same thing that America's all about. And they hate us now, a good portion of them. Let me tell you a little bit more about this crew and their international history. This isn't the first ship this crew has served on. And that's why I know the track record of this crew. This crew has been used to scuttling ships that they have been the crew of for many, many years. In 1917, this crew scuttled Tsarist Russia and handed over to the communists. In 1934, this crew scuttled Germany and sent advisors over there from Wall Street and talked them into debasing their currency till it was the most fiat currency in the world, which set the stage for socialism. Every German crying out for relief. They wouldn't have done that if those Wall Street advisors had not told the German Weimar Republic, you got to print currency to keep taxes from going too high. This ship, under the command of George C. Marshall, scuttled Red China, or scuttled Free China, and gave it over to the communists in 1948. This ship, under George C. Marshall and his yes-man lieutenant, Dwight D. Eisenhower, scuttled Eastern Europe and turned it over to Stalin at the end of World War III. Now, I'm not telling you anything new. Pardon me, World War II, yes. And this ship scuttled Cuba. This crew scuttled Nicaragua, Angola, Mozambique, Rhodesia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Vietnam, South Africa, Southwest Africa. The list could go on and on. And what I mean by scuttle, I mean they used every trick in their command in terms of the U.S. State Department to withdraw support from any freedom elements. If they were fighting a civil war, they made them go into coalition government, and then they would pull out all the military support out of one half of it, and they would undermine it and assassinate their leaders with CIA assassins so that the communists could always win. And they were met with the press. You had people like Jack Anderson and Drew Pearson who had communist sources who would make up lies about Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua so that he became the hated dictator that's supposed to be torturing thousands of people. I happen to know personally that there are no more than 75 communists in his jails, and they were all guilty of terrorism and actual criminal acts. It's a great propaganda thing. The same thing about Cuba and its freedom fighters with all of the New York Times things. But you see, these people are also chronic liars. Bill Clinton didn't start this. They lied to the American people about the situation in every one of these countries that they were scuttling. They lied about World War II and the need to send all of those Russians back into the arms of the Soviet Union when they didn't want to go in Operation Keelhaul. They lied to us about Pearl Harbor. That was a big lie. And they killed people over Pearl Harbor to get us into war. They've lied about the fall of communism. That's the greatest deception that's been pulled on the West in the history of the world. It's the widest spread deception that's ever been pulled. And you see it in every conservative magazine, ever since Ronald Reagan won the Cold War and tore the Berlin Wall down. He didn't win anything at all. The fool that he was, he's a nice guy. Ronald Reagan had sincere principles. He wasn't smart enough, though, to see when he was contradicting his principles. And thus he could be manipulated by George Bush and his crew, who were specifically put in by mandate in that special meeting, if you know about it, the Republican National Committee that Reagan was involved in, where they gave him an ultimatum. They wanted to make sure if they were going to back him, or at least treat him fairly in the press for this election, that he take George Bush as vice president and one other person as personnel director, and they could lock up that administration. But there were a few good people in the Reagan administration, and they've told the story of the insider wheeling, dealing, and the compromise that was there. In fact, I went back to serve as the chairman of the Conservative National Committee during the Reagan administration precisely because of these compromises and trying to see if we couldn't get the conservatives to hold the line and stop compromising. It's amazing how deep they would compromise because they trusted that Ronald Reagan was really not betraying them, that he was simply holding back and saving all his ammunition to give him one fell swoop. And if we kept him in power and kept compromising, that he would save us in the end. And did he save us? Not on your bet. And we got George Bush and the New World Order afterwards. They've lied to us about the war on drugs. This country is like a sieve, and the holes in that sieve are controlled by a U.S. government agency. Not the DEA, it's the CIA that controls the sieve. They run aircraft. At least a good portion of the black helicopter fleet ferries drugs regularly. They have bases in the South. You know about Mena, Arkansas. They use other aircraft. They've also got one, Marana Air Base in Arizona. They've lied to us about Waco. They've lied to us about Oklahoma. You know what the biggest lie about Oklahoma was? Well, there's several. I don't even know where to begin in Oklahoma City. You know the story, I'm sure. But the biggest lie for the press was, of course, that this is a right-wing conspiracy. When I was on the Art Bell show, one of the callers brought up the aspect of terrorism. and why it was and what type of terrorism did I anticipate. And I said, I don't expect any foreign terrorism in the United States for as long as I can see in the future. They thought that was incredulous. How can you say that? I said, well, let me tell you something. You're not asking the right questions. Here's the real question you want to ask. Do the terrorists have the arms? Do they? Do they have biological weapons? Do they have chemical weapons? You bet they do. Do they have suitcase weapons? I don't know, but they could. Do they have the funding? You bet they have the funding. Do they have the hatred of the United States? Do they have the will? Let's see, is there anything else that they don't lack? If they got the guns, if they got the terrorist weapons, the bombs, the explosives, the will, the funding, the open borders. Have we got the open borders for them? You bet we do. Walk right across that border just like the Mexicans any day of the week. What's stopping international terrorism then? Think about it. Ask the right questions. Have you thought about that? Why isn't it here? Those people are chomping at the bit. They're not here because the powers that be have told them, hands off America. It is reserved for domestic terrorism. Now you think about that. You want more proof? 3 weeks ago, Louis Freeh goes before the congressional committees to talk about his funding for terrorism. And he was waxing eloquent about his division of domestic terrorism, which is one of the largest divisions in the FBI. For these little whatever, wherever that terrorism is, he's got an awfully big division. And you know what he was predicting? He was predicting that because of Y2K, that right-wing, radical survivalist terrorists were going to take advantage of Y2K and to sow terror within the United States and create havoc, and that we need a big budget to prepare against that. Now, I'll tell you that I know and track every conservative organization around the United States, either through the internet or I know them personally. There isn't a single right-wing conservative, even survivalist that I know of, that's preparing for any terrorist acts. But every one of those militias in the United States will tell you that they have 4 or 5 infiltrators every single year from the federal agencies, and these aren't nice, clean-cut FBI agents taking notes as might be appropriate. These are thugs coming in with explosives and sawed-off shotguns and weapons, trying to get them to do something illegal, trying to set them up to do another Timothy McVeigh thing. They're not having much success, but I wouldn't doubt it. This is just a suspicion that that expert sniper, who they've never found, by the way, who took out the abortion doctor, who had, by the way, just repented and started to go public with the fact that he was sorry for being an abortionist, and took him out with a sniper barrel, might not have been a federal agent. Now, I can't prove that, but I find it awfully funny that they haven't tried very hard to find him. You know how many military units they've got in Andrews, North Carolina, trying to find, what's his name? Rudolph, Eric Rudolph. They're spending several $1 million a month there trying to find Eric Rudolph. They have no evidence that he's even around the area. What evidence do we have that they're trying to find this sniper? Not very much. It's about the same amount of effort they put into finding John Doe number 2 and 3 in the Oklahoma City bombing. Suddenly they weren't interested. Why weren't they interested? Obviously. These were the agent provocateurs that had helped Timothy McVeigh build a very sophisticated air fuel bomb, one that requires high-tech, almost nuclear explosives technology. You don't just put a charge in a barrel full of ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel. You've got to have several perfectly timed charges to ignite that as the explosion wave is expanding. You've got to keep igniting it, or it all just blows to nothing. Notwithstanding that fact, they found charges still on the pillars, the ones that didn't blow. And they have the transcripts, of course, of the firemen who were saying, oh, look at these charges down here, and we've got the bomb disposal people down here, and that finally got let out into the public. There's all kinds of things involved with that in the cover-up that was going on. So this people is used to lying, and one of the greatest lies that's been pulled off that cost them billions of dollars, and I still don't know the reason behind it, but I know it was a lie, and that's the TWA 800. How do you uncover or cover up for 180 witnesses, not just 2 or 3? This isn't the Patrick Knowlton who says that the Honda of Vince Foster was not there at the time that his body was there. That's proof, by the way, that it wasn't suicide. How does the body arrive before the car? This isn't one witness to discredit. This is 180 witnesses that don't know up from down, because you got to do a multi-million-dollar special video to prove to them that flame going down was what they saw going up, or the fuselage suddenly going up. It's just ludicrous when you look at the specificity of which some of the military witnesses, and they not only know contrails from missiles, what type they are. They can name the type of drone and what it looks like. They can name the type of explosion. A high explosion is a very grayish-white puff of smoke. It's not a big red blip. And they know the difference when you get a white puff of high explosive and then you get a red fireball, that it's two different explosions. They know the difference when they see two different types of missiles. And there were two missiles, by the way. And there were radar tracks showing two high-speed military ships leaving the area. Now you think about that. Military ships leaving a crash scene, post-haste. What's the military out for? The first thing they do is go to try to rescue people. And they make a beeline out of it. It's right on the radar tracks. The U.S. Navy says there were no Navy vessels in the area. Not true. They later had to modify and say there were 3 vessels in the area. But they weren't the vessels that they were saying they were, because they had people visually ID those. Not just anybody. Military people sitting on Long Island on the beach who know a DD from a Spruance class destroyer and other things. I mean, these are very, very good witnesses that they had to cover up. Some of them testified they received bribes of $2,000 each. Some of them said they were simply threatened. Then there was the case, of course, of the drone part that was found in the wreckage. And the fax, the mislaid fax, I don't know if you heard about that, where they sent a fax to Teledyne Ryan in Los Angeles here to find out if this drone part was part of theirs, and they said no, it came from McDonnell Douglas. Sent the fax back to the FBI, 1 digit off. It went to some lady's fax machine. It was 1 digit different than the FBI fax. Oh, isn't this interesting? The Teledyne Ryan drone piece that was in the TW-800 records does not match our records, etc. She calls the FBI, what do you want me to do with this fax? Send it right over us. And then destroy the copy. And she says, what if I don't destroy it? You will be sorry, he says. That turned her mad. She did not destroy it. She went public with it. And the press covered it up. Well, let me talk about some specifics then. How are they going to scuttle the ship of state? Let me tell you why I said 5 years. This is what I think they're planning. First of all, there's evidence that they've been building up the enemy military for many years. This is just background. FDR gave atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets in 1945. Major Jordan in this Air Force base up there in Montana uncovered it. He called the White House, he called his other security. They gave him direct orders to let those things go on the airplane. So not only do we know that this wasn't an accident, because Major Jordan actually talked to people in the White House and got countermeasures. They routed him out of the service and removed him from that base to try to cover it up. And of course you have all the secret, supposedly espionage that occurred in the Manhattan Project with several Soviet spies that were in there. You had the takeover of Europe, the allowing of the Soviets to take over Europe. And one of the purposes of allowing the Soviets to come in and take over Germany was to get a hold of the top rocket scientists so that the West could allow Russia to build up their rocket sciences in after World War II. Then in the Nixon administration, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, a Republican, allowed precision ball-bearing technology to go to the Russians. Up until that time, they could not have the precision targeting data to have MIRVed warheads, multi-reentry vehicle warheads that go off the missiles. They had to have precision ball-bearing gyros to be able to keep those things on track. They could not, they had a circular error probable, that is, of where this missile hits. There was as much as a half a mile. I mean, they would miss. That means they'd have to throw 20 or 30 or 40 missiles at every single target in order to assure destruction. We gave them, over the opposition of military and other things, through Kissinger and Nixon, precision ball-bearing technology to make sure. Is this suicide? Is this a national interest? That's what they tell you. This is in our national interest. Clinton, of course, gave cruise missile technology to them to improve their cruise missiles. IBM was just this last year allowed to give them supercomputer technology to allow them to redesign their nuclear warheads to make sure they're more potent and smaller. All at the time that we're disarming. When's the last time you saw a new missile built in the United States? And we're giving them technology to improve their nuclear weapons. as well as allowing them now, and have been allowing them to violate the MAD Treaty. Do you know what the MAD Treaty was? It was an actual treaty signed before the ABM Treaty that certified that we both agreed on mutually assured destruction. And you know what that means? That means you agree that you will not shelter your civilian population. And you agree, well, that was the primary one, that you would not shelter them and that you would not have an anti-ballistic missile system. That was certified then in the ABM Treaty of 1972. What did the Russians do immediately after signing the MAD Treaty? They began building shelters for their civilian population. Now, they don't have shelters for all their population, but they can shelter all of their leadership and all of their industrial population. That tells you what they care about. Then they signed the ABM Treaty. Immediately they began to build what? Phased array radars, ABM systems, and now they have thousands of anti-ballistic missile systems and full radar coverage and satellite coverage to direct their ABMs. Then they signed SALT I. Who disarmed under SALT I? We disarmed. Has the Russians disarmed in SALT I? No. SALT II is getting ready. It's been ratified by the U.S. Senate. The Duma and the Russians have not ratified it. Nevertheless, Bill Clinton, magnanimous unilateral disarmament expert that he is, told the Russians, if you will but sign SALT II, I will dismantle our 50 Peacekeeper missiles, our MX Peacekeeper missiles, 3 years ahead of schedule. He's so anxious to take us down, he can't stand it. You know what the Peacekeeper significant is? This is the only missile that we have that has the punch to hit hardened targets, to penetrate hardened targets. That's why he's anxious to get those out, or the Russians are anxious too. And what do we do to make sure that the Russians feel good about these compromises? Because they still feel insecure. Now, how can the Russians feel insecure with all the disarmament that has gone on? Well, you look at psychology of the Russians. It's like mafia. Can you ever convince the mafia? If you get two mafia chiefs together and the mafia says, here's my gun, here's my knife, here's my special laser weapon, here's my henchman, shoots him in the back, I'm here for the taking. The other mafia guy looks at him, what are you holding behind your sleeve there? He doesn't trust them, does he? Why would he trust anyone? He doesn't trust himself. He knows he would cheat. He knows he would never do that. So why would the Americans? In fact, that's what the intercepts from the Soviets keep showing. Can't believe the Americans gave in so easy. They must be cheating. So you see, that kind of destabilizes. Maybe that's the way the Lord has bought us a few years, keeping the Russians destabilized. They know what's going on in Area 51, or at least partially. They're really worried about Area 51 because they never know what the U.S. has up their sleeve. They're convinced that if they're giving so much away, they must have something terrible. And that's why the Russians are adamant about stealing more technology, getting more technology. And what are they doing? They're building now the new Topol-M missile, SS-27 missile, 5th or 6th generation new ICBM. Now notice we're supposed to be disarming, and we're allowing them, even under SALT II, to build 3 new Topol-Ms per month. They're going for a squadron of 500 Topol-M missiles. And because of the uproar that was caused by Clinton's acquiescing to the Republicans' desire to build an ABM system, he offered them what, $6.6 billion over the next 5 years? Now, by the way, that was non-committal. There are no budget agreements actually requiring that he go through. That's just, it's easy to say that's on the table. It'll be withdrawn, I'll tell you. But nevertheless, the Russians came unglued when they thought President Clinton, who was their boy, was going to give an ABM system to the Americans. Now, why would they be so concerned about an ABM system? It's purely defensive. You can't threaten the Russians, can they? Not unless you're going to shoot IBACMs at the U.S. Then you'd be worried about that, wouldn't you? But to make the Russians feel good, the Clinton administration last month offered them a deal. If you won't complain about our ABM system, and it's only 200 interceptors, it really isn't a threat to you. But to make you feel good, we'll allow you not only to deploy this 500 Topol-Ms, but we will allow you to put 3 MIRVed warheads on it. That will give you 1,500 new warheads in addition to the 30,000 that you already have, so that you can feel secure, that you can overwhelm any ABM system that we have. You need more proof that this crew intends to scuttle the ship? How about PDD 60? Mandating in November 1997 that the U.S. military absorb a first strike from the Soviet Union. Absorb one, and then retaliate in mass. How do you retaliate after you absorbed a first strike? Especially when you tell the Russians, we're going to take the first one. You induce them to do what? To give you all they can give in the first strike, because you've told them we're going to give you a freebie. That's what the military was complaining about, but didn't have the guts to go public with it. And then the crowning jewel of this proof that they're intending to take us down is that the Clinton administration tells the Republicans, now remember, I guess you can build an ABM system, but you can't deploy anything till after 2005. Why would they care about delaying until after a certain date? Well, the Republicans did one up on them, didn't they? Just today or yesterday, they passed a resolution saying we're going to deploy an ABM system as fast as technological possible. That could be as fast as 2 years, actually. But it won't work, because I'll tell you why. The one who controls the technology that goes into that ABM system is the Compliance Committee for the 1972 ABM, which is a federally funded committee which tells every subcontractor building anti-ballistic missiles what the limits are on the technology they can put into those missiles. And you know what the limits are? A radar that cannot see fast or see further than 50 miles. We got radars on missiles that can see over 150 to 300 miles. They cannot have any data link interlinked with satellites. We got satellites up there, brilliant pebbles and other types of satellites that can see launches immediately and could have those missiles in the air and feeding them data, targeting data, so that we would hit those ICBMs at the apogee. Clear up here where when they exploded, if they had biological and chemical weapons, it wouldn't do any damage. But when you have another limitation, you have a 3 kilometer per second speed limit on the missiles, you can't catch missiles with them. And what you do with a 3 kilometer per second, it takes off so slow that when these things come screaming in at 12 kilometers per second, you can barely reach them like you saw on television during the Gulf War. They go up there about a half a mile in the air, and that's about as fast as they can hit those things, if they hit them at all. And then what happens if it's a biological chemical weapon? It rains right down in your city, and they win anyway. The THAAD missile system, which has a higher range to it, but no faster speed limit, has missed every single last test of the 5 tests that they've had. You know why it's missing? You just can't catch missiles that have come screaming in like this with a little slow-flying missile. You can't do it. Now let's analyze why. What's the Russian motive in attacking the United States? Some people have asked me, they want the U.S. intact. They want the economic engine. Why would they want to destroy this? They want to destroy it because, in fact, it's too far away to control. This would be a Vietnam for Russia to try to invade and hold the United States, especially with 300 million private weapons. Even if the government started collecting them now, it'd be 10 years before they got even half of them, and I doubt if they'd find the other half. Am I right?
They'd run out of agents.
Yeah, the agents don't last long looking for weapons in America. So the Russians have decided, in my estimation, and that's why they can be induced to do this strike, the Russians have decided we want Europe. Now they got to have an economic basket, don't they? They can't feed themselves, never will be able to feed themselves communism. They got to have somebody to feed them, and Europe is the one. It's close, can be controlled. That's what they want. And so by taking out the U.S. military, all they got to do is turn to Europe and say, if you want the same thing to happen to you, just try to fight. Will Europe back down? Are they real tough, hard-nosed individuals? What about the peace movements in Europe? The Soviets have been working on the peace movement in Europe just to make sure that the Europeans will not fight. What's in it for the New World Order? Now that's the big question that Art Bell asked me on that interview. He said, I can't believe that Bill Clinton would push the button on himself. And I said, well, in the first place, he's not going to get killed in this if he's the president when this happens, which he won't be. Who's ever the president, these people are going to know when this attack is coming. These people have enough control within Russia that they will know. They've got spies. They know when that button's going to be pushed, and they haven't built those very sophisticated bunkers under the Greenbrier and under Mount Weather and various other things, which have been turned over to private entities, by the way. The government is not